What kind of man walks into the storm of war when the world has already forgotten his name? Patriot. Before this story begins, I need you to look around this camp with me. The mud, the cold breath of dawn, the weary faces carrying the weight of a nation not yet born. Here men fight not for glory but for dignity, for the promise of freedom whispered from one trembling heart to another. And it's in this place of struggle and humiliation that a fragile silhouette appears. A man, the young. Soldiers expected to mock, not to salute. Jonathan Hale, old, slow, hands shaking from years that carved deep into his bones. When he stepped forward and offered himself as a volunteer, the English might have laughed. And the young patriots here did too. Snickers behind raised muskets, smirks dripping with doubt. They saw weakness. They smelled defeat. They believed age was a curse, not a sacrifice. But they knew nothing of betrayal, of scars carried in silence, of a spirit that refuses to die. Even when the body falters, and tonight you will see what they failed to see. Welcome, Patriot. Are you already subscribed? Leave your like to strengthen this camp of freedom seekers. All right then, now we can begin. They laughed first with their eyes. 3 boys in fresh coats, boots barely scuffed by mud, swaggering as if the winter itself bowed to them. "He can't even hold a musket," one said, tilting his hat with the swagger of a tavern prince. Another twirled his bayonet and let the steel sing like a cruel fiddle. The third clapped sarcastically, a thin smile stretching into open insult. The sound rippled through the camp. Men who had buried sons pretended not to see. Women stirring thin stew lowered their gaze. A child pressed his face into his grandmother's shawl. The disgrace moved like wind through canvas walls, quick and cutting, and the old man stood in the middle of it with his hands shaking, as if liberty itself trembled inside him. Jonathan Hale did not speak. He adjusted his grip and raised the musket an inch, then 2. It weighed like a memory, a heavy memory, loaded with betrayal and smoke and names no one dared to say aloud. The 3 youths laughed harder. Their mockery wasn't just for him. It was for every poor farmer whose back had been bent by taxes and lashes, every militia private who had traded bread for powder, every elder who had watched English officers count coins while children shivered. The camp seemed to agree with the jeers because fear teaches people to nod along. Fear and hunger, fear and the habit of humiliation. "Go warm the fires, Grandpa," one of them said, and he made a bow as if greeting a noble. The gesture had the polish of wealthy merchants who measure men by silk. It smelled of London coin. It carried the old contagion of contempt. For a heartbeat, even the guards on the ridge smirked. It would have been easier for Jonathan to lower the weapon and walk away. Easier to be quiet and small and let the degradation pass like a rain squall. He had done that before, in another war, under another flag, after officers toasted a victory that cost farmers their winter. He had watched villages emptied for profit. He had seen the hidden truth of empire, that it feeds on the dignity of those it calls unimportant. He steadied the barrel and breathed. "You want to train," he whispered, the words almost swallowed by the cold. "Then learn the first lesson." The boys scoffed. "Listen," said the tallest. "It speaks." More laughter. But a few faces by the cook fire turned. A thin militia sergeant with a scar along his cheek paused. A mother, sleeves damp from washing rags, lifted her eyes. Children peeked around wheels and crates. The wind quieted like a listening animal. "Lesson 1, Jonathan said, not raising his voice, "is that a musket is only a tool. Your arm is another, your breath a third, your decision the fourth, and your will," he added, "is the only one the enemy cannot buy." His hands stopped, shaking. Age did not vanish. It obeyed him. The tremor became a slow, deliberate pulse. He drew the flint down, checked the pan by touch, set the butt to his shoulder with a motion that wasted nothing, and announced nothing. In that small economy, something changed. Not yet respect. Not yet. But a crack ran through the laugh. The English had always believed the colonists would break. Generals in polished boots wagered on it. Officers signed papers that sold fields out from under widows. Merchants fixed prices, while wagons of grain stood locked behind ledgers. The empire learned to make dependence look like order, to make obedience feel like safety. And here, in the dirt, an old man showed the opposite. Independence carried in bone and breath. The tallest youth stepped closer. "Aim at what, grandfather? The stew pot?" Jonathan didn't look at him. He looked past him, toward the hill where, weeks earlier, redcoats had dragged a farmer for refusing a bribe, leaving him in the snow like garbage. The memory sharpened the sight. "Aim at shame," he said. "Aim at the part of you that enjoys this." Silence pressed down. Snow hissed in the fire. The second youth tried for another jest, found none, and settled for a sneer. "If you fire, you'll fall over." Jonathan did not fire. He lowered the musket an inch and asked the boy to hold it. The youth grabbed the stock, casual as taking a cup. Surprise hit him a moment later. Weight is honest. He shifted. Elbow slipped. Jonathan guided, his hands without insult, and in that quiet instruction there was rebellion, not against the boys, against the habit of disgrace that had soaked into the camp. "Feet," he murmured. He moved the heel. "Breath." He waited for the chest to settle. "Focus. Do not let contempt teach you how to see." The boy flushed, then steadied. The third youth, the one with the cleanest boots, grew restless. "This is nonsense," he barked, suddenly loud enough to sound brave. He pointed the bayonet toward the line of wagons where children hid. "What trains us is battle, not bedtime stories." Jonathan's gaze did not leave the boy holding the musket. "Battle trains no one," he said. "It exposes what you already decided to become." The words landed heavy. They were not poetry. They were inventory. Sacrifice, betrayal, struggle, choice, counted like powder charges. The camp listened because the camp knew. Decisions made in mud become oaths or graves. Somewhere, a drummer practiced 3 soft taps and stopped, as if he too were weighing something. The mother by the stew lifted her spoon and froze. The scarred sergeant stepped closer until the shadow of his coat fell across the boys. He did not speak, but the line of his jaw said he had heard enough laughter to last 3 wars. Jonathan stepped back and let the youth aim. "At what?" the boy asked, voice lower now. "At the peg above that burned tent flap." The boy squinted. "I can't see it." "Then you're not ready to see what must be done," Jonathan said, and he was not cruel, only exact. "Close your other eye. Empty your mind of the insult you wanted to say. Hold. Breathe. Hold." The boy breathed. The world narrowed. The camp, for a heartbeat, shared one breath. Even the detractors felt it, though pride kept their mouths hard. Jonathan's hand rested near the lock, not touching, only there, like a promise. He did not speak of the secret he carried, the revelation that would make sense of his shaking hands and steady heart. He did not say whose orders he once refused or whose blood money he returned. He only watched the boy decide who he would be when the steel roared and the smoke lifted. Snow drifted. The fire sighed. Somewhere far beyond these ragged tents, noblemen counted profits and wrote letters dripping with contempt. Here, in this fragile camp of hungry patriots, a different arithmetic took shape. Breath, focus, resolve, dignity. The shot had not yet been taken, but its echo was already traveling through the ranks, altering more than aim. It was the beginning of a transformation, not just for 3 mocking boys, but for a weary encampment aching for liberty and aching to believe in itself again. And as the old man set his palm lightly behind the stock, as he readied a lesson born of long roads and harder winters, the air thickened with the nearness of consequence, and the hill seemed to lean closer, waiting for what would be revealed when the smoke finally rose. Morning hardened into iron. The camp formed. A crooked line along the churned ground, boots planted, cheeks raw from wind. The first drill was simple. Load, raise, breathe, lower. The kind of practice a farmhand could learn in an hour, and a noble would hire another man to perform. Powder hissed. Ramrods clinked. Smoke lifted in thin veils. Jonathan moved among them without hurry, eyes tracing elbows, shoulders, lungs. He didn't bark orders. He let the rhythm guide him, a quiet metronome in a world built on noise. The three youths grouped, together, restless as colts. The tallest kept glancing at the hill as if glory might ride down and salute him. The one with the bright boots scuffed a frozen clod, bored already. The third, freckled, raw with pride, watched Jonathan's hands like a hawk watches weakness. "Show us how the ancients march, grandfather," the freckled boy shouted, loud enough for the officers to hear. Laughter sparked. A pair of quartermasters grinned over their ledger. A drummer coughed to hide a smile. The insult carried farther than the smoke. It carried to women trying to stretch broth, to children wrapping rags around ankles, to an elder stitching a torn blanket with fingers stiff from cold. This was not a private jest. It was a public degradation, permission to sneer in a place starving for respect. Jonathan did not answer. He adjusted a recruit's stance, 2 fingers on a boot heel, 1 on a shoulder blade. He corrected a grip with a nod. He touched the musket of the freckled boy and felt the barrel quiver, not from wind, from nerves disguised as arrogance. "Breathe," he said to another man, barely a word, more a shared breath. When the freckled boy called again, "Perhaps the old saint will levitate the ball with prayer," the camp tilted toward him, eager for spectacle. Even the thin sergeant's scar seemed to harden. The officers on the ridge watched with the stillness of hunters, calculating if mockery broke discipline or built it. "First volley," Jonathan announced, at last breaking his silence, but he spoke as if speaking to the earth. "On my hand." He held it up, steady, a stake in the mud. The freckled boy rolled his eyes and mimed the tremor they expected. Jonathan's hand held like a star against the grey. He dropped it. The line fired raggedly, 2 misfires, 1 late spark. The echo slapped the canvas walls and died too soon. "Again," he said. The second volley stitched tighter, still uneven. The tall boy smirked at the peg he failed to hit earlier, then at Jonathan's back. "Your method is out of fashion," he called. "The English do it with polish, with science, with officers who can read." He aimed his words at the ridge, begging approval from the men with clean gloves. Jonathan moved to him, close enough to see the pulse jump in the boy's throat. "I have seen their polish," he murmured. "It shines best when it reflects the grief of the poor. No anger, no ornament, just a ledger entry written in bone." He shifted the boy's foot a finger width, brought his elbow in, pressed the stock deeper into the pocket of the shoulder. Again. The third volley cracked sharper. A child near the wagons flinched, then stood taller. Women stopped stirring to listen. The revelation arrived not from a speech, but from the rhythm. Breath, will, release. It felt like a small rebellion in the open, a refusal to let disgrace set the rules. The officers exchanged a glance that said nothing and confessed everything. Power hates quiet competence because it cannot purchase it. The freckled boy surged forward with his final jest. He bowed in a merchant's flourish, then dropped into a grotesque imitation of age, knees wobbling, mouth puckered, voice quavering. "Observe the miracle of independence," he crowed, and the words independence and miracle turned to tools of contempt. The camp chuckled, tired and eager to be on the winning side of any laugh. He thrust the musket into Jonathan's hands. "Teach us, prophet, teach us how the past limps." The old man received the weapon as if accepting a confession. He checked the flint by touch. He weighed the stock the way a farmer judges harvest, with memory, not measurement. He faced the line and placed himself beside the weakest recruit, a boy with raw hands and the eyes of someone who had seen a barn burn from a tax debt. Jonathan did not lecture. He loaded. The motions were spare, exact, clean as winter light over ice. The tremor that had fed every joke faded to a disciplined hum. He waited for the wind's small pause that he alone seemed to hear. "On my breath," he said. He inhaled once. The line followed. He exhaled. The volley cracked almost as one. The sound was different now, fuller, anchored. The freckled boy blinked. The peg above the burned tent flap split. Not a lucky tear. A deliberate cut. No one cheered. The silence felt like a door opening onto something larger than pride. "Again," Jonathan said, handing the musket back to the freckled boy without looking at him, as if returning a promise. "But this time you will not aim at wood." His gaze lifted toward the hill. Snow lay there where a farmer had fallen weeks before for refusing a bribe dressed as law. "You will aim at the part of yourself that kneels to contempt. You will aim at your own willingness to disgrace the weak. Fire only when you feel it flinch." The boy swallowed. His jest had nowhere to stand. He found the sight with his left eye shut, as instructed. His chest steadied. The tall boy and the one with bright boots edged closer, caught between loyalty to mockery and the pull of something older, a demand for dignity, carved deeper than fashion. The women near the pots leaned in. The scarred sergeant crossed his arms and let the shadow of his sleeve fall over their bravado like a benediction. Across the ridge, an officer laughed to his companion, a thin silver sound. They took notes on shortages and spoke of supply chains, as if human bones were crates. Wealthy merchants had sent letters promising more. Powder if prices rose, if terms improved, if obedience sharpened. The air tasted of that bargain, stale and metallic. Jonathan's silence answered it. Sacrifice had a different currency. It demanded decisions no ledger could tally. The freckled boy fired. He missed the peg. He did not look at the old man. He looked at his own hands as if meeting them for the first time. Shame warmed his face, not the hot shame of ridicule, but the honest sting that precedes change. The tall boy's jaw softened. The bright boots scuffed deeper into the mud, no longer polished enough for preening. "Reset," Jonathan said softly. "We begin again." He moved down the line like time itself, patient, relentless, carrying a hidden truth he had not yet named. It gathered around him the way frost gathers on wire, quiet, certain, turning the ordinary into a sign. Somewhere behind the tents, an elder led a whispered prayer for the living, not for victory, but for conscience. A mother wiped a child's face and nodded. Toward the field as if pointing to school. The officers on the ridge turned away at last, bored by what they could not count. The camp did not turn away. The camp watched a frail figure hold a wall against disgrace without raising his voice, and in that steadfastness they recognized a road, not an easy path, a journey through snow, through hunger, through betrayal dressed as policy. A road that asked for transformation, not of bodies alone, but of hearts hardened by fear. Smoke thinned. Day leaned toward iron afternoon. Breath plumed and faded. The freckled boy reloaded with care, the tremor now in his pride, not in his fingers. Jonathan stepped back only when the line no longer needed his shadow to stand straight. "Again," he said once more, and the word did not mean repetition. It meant renewal. It meant choice. It meant the first bricks of independence laid with powder and patience. He lifted his hand for the next signal, and as it hovered, as the camp poised between habit and awakening, a messenger on a lathered horse broke the grey horizon, bearing news that would test every oath they were just now learning to make. Night settled over the camp like a heavy shroud, muffling footsteps, swallowing voices. The drills were done. Fires sank into embers. Families curled beneath torn blankets, clinging to scraps of warmth that winter and war had not yet stolen. But beneath the surface of that fragile quiet, something darker moved. Pride wounded by an old man's steadiness. Humiliation curdled into spite. 3 young soldiers huddled near the edge of the tents, their faces lit by a single wavering flame that made them look older than they were, and crueler. The tall one spat into the dirt. "He made fools of us." His jaw clenched like a trap. The others saw it. The one with the bright boots, now stained by mud he could no longer ignore, kicked a stone into the darkness. They listened to him, not to us. And the freckled boy, whose bravado had cracked under the weight of a missed shot, stared at the ground as if searching for courage in the frozen earth. "We can't let him stay. He'll turn the camp against us." Their whispers slithered like smoke. The thin sergeant slept nearby, unaware. Children murmured in dreams shaped by hunger. Far above, the ridge held the silhouettes of English officers, still watching, still measuring the colonists' weakness as if weighing livestock. Disgrace lingered in the air, its bitter scent a gift from every noble who believed these men would never stand as equals. "He's old," the tall boy growled. "One mistake and he's dead anyway. We just help it happen." The suggestion tasted of betrayal, but he swallowed it as if swallowing fire. The others glanced around, hearts thudding, not with bravery, but with fear twisted into rebellion of the wrong kind. "What do you propose?" the freckled boy asked. His voice trembled, though he tried to hide it behind contempt. "The northern watchtower," the tall one said. "Weak. Beams. Loose joints. Snow piling on the roof. If someone were to adjust the support—" "It falls," the bright-booted youth finished. "Looks like time did the job. No blood on our hands," the tall boy added, though they all knew that lie would burn if held too close. A horse snorted in the shadows. They froze. But it was only the messenger's mount, tired and weary, waiting for dawn's orders. Far away, wealthy merchants would soon read letters about shortages, demanding obedience before, delivering supplies. And here were boys, poor farmers' sons, militia hopefuls, becoming instruments of degradation, not by English command, but by their own decisions. A smaller tyranny, born inside them, a transformation rooted in shame. The bright-booted boy knelt and traced a crude map in the dirt. "We loosen these 2 beams. Snow does the rest. No one will question it. The old man takes the evening watch, doesn't he?" "He volunteered," the tall one said with a smirk that tried to hide guilt. "Of course he did. Men like him can't resist sacrifice." The freckled boy hesitated. A long breath shivered out of him. "He was patient with us today." "That's why this works," the tall one snapped. "He trusts us. That's his weakness. Trust. A blade sharper than any bayonet, and they wielded it without understanding the cost. Wind slipped through the trees, carrying the distant echo of chains from a loyalist prison camp, where English officers punished farmers who dared whisper about liberty. That sound, imagined or real, should have united them, should have stoked fire against the empire. Instead, jealousy smothered sense. They waited until the camp finally stilled, until snores blended with the crackling of dying fires, until even the guards stopped pacing with vigilance. Then, like shadows unworthy of the moon, they crept toward the northern grove. Snow crushed under their boots, soft as breath. The watchtower rose before them, lean, weary, built by unskilled hands and desperate hope. The tall one tested a beam. It groaned faintly. "Easy." The bright-booted boy pulled a wedge free. Wood dust drifted like pale ash. The freckled boy worked slower, glancing back at the camp where a lantern flickered outside a tent, Jonathan's tent. A silhouette moved inside, a frail figure folding a blanket, preparing for the cold hours ahead. The old man's quiet dignity cut through the boy's chest, like winter wind. "We shouldn't," he whispered. The tall one's hand clamped his shoulder. "We finish." or we're the ones disgraced. Another beam loosened, another nail slipped free. The tower shuddered, a tired creature waiting for the final blow, and still no one stopped. Fear of losing face chained them tighter than English law ever could. Snow gathered on the roof. More weight, more strain. One gust would be enough. One man climbing the ladder would seal his fate. When the last beam was tampered with, the boys stepped back. Their breaths steamed in the air, sharp with dread. The forest listened. The tower leaned, not yet falling, but doomed. They returned to camp with hurried steps, each heartbeat louder than the one before. None spoke. None dared look toward the northern wood. Guilt traveled beside them like an unwanted companion, and as they crawled under their blankets, trying to bury their own choices, a lantern sparked to life near the edge of camp. Jonathan Hale preparing for his night watch, unaware that the next step of his journey carried him straight toward a revelation carved in betrayal and cold timber, waiting in the darkness between the trees. The cold bit deeper at night, turning the forest into a maze of breath and shadow. Jonathan Hale walked toward the northern grove with the slow steadiness of someone who had carried too many winters on his back. Lantern light swayed in his hand, a fragile glow fighting a darkness thick as smoke. Behind him, the camp murmured in sleep. Children wrapped in patched quilts, widows hunched near fading embers, farmers dreaming of fields stolen by taxes, militiamen clinging to the fragile hope of independence. They slept because they had to. He walked because someone needed to. The watchtower rose between the trees, a crooked silhouette leaning ever so slightly, as if bowing to an invisible weight. Jonathan felt the shift before he touched the ladder. Wood strained like an old wound reopening. He paused, listened. The wind whispered, but something else spoke through the creaking joints. A warning born, not from time, but from hands. Still, duty outweighed doubt. He placed his boot on the first rung. It groaned. He climbed, one step, then another. Snow slid from the roof in small cascades. The lantern's flame guttered as if afraid. At the top platform he took his post. Pain hummed in his shoulder, never fully leaving him since a different war under a foreign crown. But he ignored it. He always had. He scanned the ridge. English officers lounged near their distant fires, their laughter drifting. Faintly through the pines, thin, sharp, triumphant. They were counting coins, not casualties. For them, colonists were numbers, not names. Property, not people. Every sneer they cast toward the camp carried the same message. Dignity was a luxury the poor were not meant to afford. Jonathan steadied his breath. Snow settled. The tower shifted again. A tremor ran beneath his boots. He frowned. The last storm had not been strong enough to warp the beams. The supports had been reinforced, just two. Weeks earlier by a carpenter with hands calloused from a lifetime of honest toil. No natural weakness would have emerged this quickly. And there, near the joint by his left foot, splinters that were too clean, too new. Not from age, from tools. He knelt slowly. The platform moaned at the change in weight. Pain stabbed his ribs. He ignored it. His lantern revealed a wedge placed deliberately off-center, forced back into place poorly, like someone trying to mimic erosion. He touched the wood. It crumbled more easily than it should have. Sabotage, done by hands that knew where to cut. Not English hands. This tower was too obscure, too insignificant for their attention. No, this was closer, sharper, wounded pride wearing the shape of treachery. He exhaled a long breath. Betrayal did not surprise him. He had seen it before in soldiers who traded loyalty for favor, in officers who sold out villages for silver. Treason always grew fastest among those afraid of transformation. A sharp crack exploded beneath him. The beam buckled. Jonathan threw himself toward the railing. Too slow. The floor split like a jaw. The world dropped. The lantern flew from his hand, spilling sparks into the snow. He fell, pain ripping through his shoulder as the wood tore past, air punching from his lungs in a brutal grunt. He slammed into a lower beam. The impact drove a white-hot bolt through his ribs. His fingers clawed instinctively, finding rough bark on a leaning trunk. He hung there for a heartbeat, boots dangling above the frozen ground. Agony pulsed with each breath. Then the tower groaned again, threatening to finish its collapse. Jonathan let go. He hit the snow hard enough to choke. Darkness swarmed the edges of his vision. The pain in his ribs sharpened. Something inside protested with every inhale. His shoulder throbbed as if the bone itself remembered too many battles. But he was alive, and more than alive, aware. He pushed himself upright, gritting against the fire in his chest, and limped toward the broken base of the tower. The sabotage was unmistakable. Tool marks, forced wedges, nails pulled and shoved back in crooked, a child's imitation of wear. He brushed snow aside and found footprints, 3 sets, clustered too close together to be chance. 3 boys, 3 bruised egos, 3 fools who had chosen disgrace over courage. His breath trembled, not from fear, but from revelation. Hurt was familiar. Dishonor was not. He straightened slowly. Pain made his vision pulse, but his spine held, because something deeper than the wound began to rise inside him, a resolve carved not from anger, but from duty, a decision older than the empire he now resisted. He looked back toward the camp, where lanterns flickered faintly through the trees. The boys would be asleep, or pretending to be. They thought they had hidden the truth beneath snow and darkness. They thought age made him fragile. But they had forgotten one thing. A man who has already lost everything. To tyranny cannot be broken by a fall. Jonathan inhaled, though pain clawed at the motion. The cold burned his throat. The forest around him waited, silent, as if standing witness to a turning point carved in frost and betrayal. He wiped the blood from his lip, steadied his steps, and began the slow walk back toward camp, toward confrontation, toward revelation, toward the next breath of a journey that would test not only his body, but the courage of every soul sleeping under those tattered tents. Snow muffled every sound except Jonathan's breath, ragged and uneven, scraping the walls of his chest like a dull blade. The forest had swallowed the crash of the tower. No alarm rose from the camp. No footsteps rushed to help. The night was too deep, too cold, too tired to care about a single old man lying broken in the snow. He pushed himself onto one knee, pain exploding along his ribs, and forced his body upright with the grim resolve of someone who had outlived too many defeats to surrender to another. The ruined watchtower loomed before him, slanted, wounded, its beams jutting like broken bones. Lantern light from the distant camp flickered weakly through the trunks, barely reaching him. He preferred it that way. Darkness was an ally now. Silence a shield. He crouched beside the fallen beam, fingers trembling as he brushed away snow. The cut was fresh, too clean, not chewed by storms, but carved by steel. He pressed his thumb into the exposed grain. Splinters answered. Hymn-like testimony. Sharp edges, flat pressure marks, a clumsy attempt to mimic decay. Whoever had done this worked fast, but not skillfully. Jonathan lifted a fragment of wood to his lantern's dying glow. The splinter glimmered with bright sawdust, new, unmistakable, no doubt remained. This was sabotage, born not from English cruelty, but from boys who had allowed shame to ferment into treachery. He pocketed the fragment. Evidence mattered. Truth mattered. Liberty demanded clarity, not guesses. Whispered in anger. He followed the first set of footprints. They wove clumsily around the tower, pacing, doubling back. Impatience. The taller boy, most likely. The one who hid his insecurity behind swagger. A second trail circled the supports, lighter, feet closer together. The bright-booted youth, always skittish, always fidgeting. And the third pair, those were hesitant, uneven, stopping often. The freckled boy, the one who almost cracked earlier, the one who looked at the musket the way a frightened man looks at a mirror. 3 sets, 3 hearts poisoning their own camp, not out of malice but fear. Fear of losing status, fear of their own reflection. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Breath burned. His shoulder throbbed as if the fall had tried to rip the arm clean off. Every movement reminded him of age, but age had its advantages. It granted patience. It taught the weight of decisions. It revealed the hidden truth lodged beneath fresh disgrace. No rebellion survives if it's own. Children choose treachery before sacrifice. He limped to the ladder's broken remains. More marks. Nails dug out and hammered back without conviction. Splinters arranged to disguise the crime. Whoever planned this thought the darkness would bury the evidence. Darkness fails fools. It remembers everything. He pressed his palm to the shattered wood. The texture told him enough. The angle of the cuts, the depth, the hesitation. These were hands that had never built anything, only broken things. A gust of wind howled through the grove, rattling the half-collapsed frame. Snow drifted in thin spirals. The English fires glowed faintly on the distant ridge, their officers still awake, laughing lightly, their silhouettes sharp against the sky. They had no idea their enemy nearly destroyed itself tonight, or perhaps they expected such degradation. Perhaps they trusted the colonists to implode under their own insecurity. Jonathan clenched his jaw. Independence was not won by muskets alone. It required dignity sharper than any blade. And tonight, dignity had been tested. He knelt again, carefully, painfully, and gathered the last pieces of evidence. Fresh chips, a loose nail, soil disturbed by nervous boots. He collected them methodically, like a man assembling a puzzle whose solution might fracture the camp before dawn. Then he rose, slow but unyielding. A branch cracked somewhere behind him. His lantern hissed, flame shrinking as though startled. Jonathan turned, breath held, ribs. Screaming, darkness crowded the trees. Nothing moved, no English patrol, no militia scout. Only a long shadow that disappeared between 2 pines, too soft to be wind, too light to be a beast. Someone had followed him here, or watched him fall. The pain in his chest pulsed harder, warning him, not just sabotage, eyes, witnesses. Maybe guilt dragging one of the boys back to see if the plan had worked. Maybe something else entirely. The forest answered with silence. Jonathan tightened his grip on the lantern and began the slow journey back toward camp. He walked not as prey, but as a man carrying a revelation heavy enough to change more than a night's watch. His boots left shallow prints beside the tracks he had studied moments earlier. Snow swallowed his steps, but not the truth he carried. Light from the tents grew brighter with every breath. Somewhere among those shapes lay 3 boys who had chosen disgrace over honor. And somewhere deeper lay the question that mattered most, whether they were still salvageable, or whether this betrayal would fracture the fragile unity their struggle so desperately needed. Jonathan inhaled, steadying the fire in his ribs. The night did not feel cold anymore. It felt expectant, as if waiting for the first spark of a confrontation that would test not only the boys, but the soul of the encampment itself. Dawn bled into the canvas roofs, pale and unforgiving. Frost clung to ropes and rifles. The camp stirred with the slow ache of hunger. Women coaxed thin flames from wet wood. Children carried buckets with numb hands. A bell clanged once, then twice. Routine. Order pretending to be strength. Jonathan Hale stood beneath the flagpole with his arm in a rough sling, shoulder bound tight under a borrowed coat. He had slept little, he had spoken less. Before sunrise he went to the council's tent, placed the splinters on the table beside the ledgers, and asked for a routine demonstration of instructor skill. Nothing more. His voice remained calm. He did not accuse, he requested. Discipline had to look like sunlight, not lightning. The council agreed. They needed confidence as much as bread. A public display would steady spirits. Let the boys lead it. Let the camp see precision. The decision cost them nothing, or so they believed. By mid-morning, a ring formed on the drill field. Farmers with cracked knuckles, elders wrapped in patched shawls, militiamen rubbing sleep from their eyes. Even the quartermasters came, ink on, their fingers, curiosity pricking like a thorn. Beyond the tree line, British officers glinted on the ridge, small figures of polished certainty. They watched through spyglasses, amused, expecting clumsiness, expecting disgrace. To them, the crowd below was a ledger of failures to be exploited by wealthy merchants and titled men whose pity ended at the edge of a coin. Jonathan lifted his good hand for quiet. The sling made him look smaller. Age made him look slower. The camp's murmur softened. Breath steamed into the pale air. "Today," he said, voice steady, "we observe our instructors." He named the three. Their heads jerked up like hounds catching scent. Surprise flickered, then pride. The tall one smoothed his coat. The bright-booted boy kicked snow from the seams. The freckled youth swallowed, throat tight, but stepped forward with the others. They bowed awkwardly toward the council. They did not glance at Jonathan. Courage found better places to stand. "Demonstrate stance, loading, and the elements of aim," Jonathan continued. "No heat, no scorn, just the plain spine of order." He turned to the line. "Watch closely. Liberty begins with details." The tall boy took the first rifle. He planted his feet wide, the way parade manuals showed. It looked crisp. It also wasted strength. Jonathan let the camp see it before speaking. "Heel," he said. A small correction. He addressed the crowd, not the boy. "A heel too far cheats your lungs. Then your lungs cheat your will." He stepped aside. Powder measured. Ball seated. Ramrod returned. The motions were clean. Too clean. Performed for eyes, not for weather. Women near the front nodded anyway. They wanted to be proud of something. Jonathan gestured to the freckled youth. "Explain the lock." The boy began a recitation learned the night before. Sparks, frizzen, pan. He said each word carefully, hiding panic beneath polish. Jonathan listened, then reached into his coat and placed a small wedge of pine on the boy's palm, fresh, pale, smelling of sap and guilt. "And explain the difference," Jonathan said mildly, "between a surface that wears by time and a surface that is forced to look worn." The boy froze. The wedge seemed to burn. He knew that smell. He knew that brightness. He stared at the grain as if it might accuse him outright. A murmur rippled through the ring. Some understood, some did not. The council shifted, sensing weather. The bright-booted youth rushed in to fill the silence. "We are soldiers, not carpenters," he said with a brittle laugh meant for spectators. He lifted his musket high. "What matters is fire." He snapped the weapon to his shoulder and aimed toward a peg set on a post. The crowd leaned in. The crack was sharp. The shot tore low. He smiled anyway, eager for approval from men on the ridge who would never grant it. A child's applause stuttered and died. Jonathan picked up another fragment of wood from a pouch. A sliver, a curved nail bent wrong. He held them too. The light the way a priest might lift a relic. "Fire matters," he said, "but it is not the first law." His tone remained gentle. The ring tightened. Structure is law. Oath is law. If you weaken a frame, you borrow collapse from the future and make it arrive today. He dropped the sliver into the boy's hand. It made no sound at all, yet the field heard it. The tall one bristled. "With respect, sir, you lecture from injury. Perhaps a fall has confused your judgment." He meant to humiliate. He delivered a confession. Eyes shifted from his mouth to his boots, where new scratches cut across polished leather. Pine dust clung to the seam like frost. Jonathan did not look at the scratches. He faced the ring instead. This morning, the northern watchpost failed. No drama, only iron. Not from snow, not from time, from decisions. The word hung there, a flake of ice that would not melt. 3 sets of prints in the grove, 3 different strides, one impatient, one fidgeting, one halting, as if a conscience gripped the heel and would not let it move. The freckled boy's breath hitch was small, but the silence caught it. The scarred sergeant moved closer, not to menace, but to stand witness. Women set their ladles down. A grandmother drew a child against her coat. Dignity took its place in the circle like a 4th judge. Demonstration, Jonathan repeated softly. That is what we promised the council. He stepped to a rough frame he had asked the carpenters to drag onto the field. 3 crude beams lashed into a corner, a training tool for bayonet practice now serving as truth's scaffolding. You will show the camp how to read wood as carefully as you read wind. He touched one joint. Which cut lives? He touched another. Which fails? He touched the last and left his hand there. And which one was asked to pretend? The tall boy's jaw worked. He glanced toward the ridge, toward officers who smirked behind glass. No help came. The bright-booted youth shifted his weight, the snow telling the small story of a restless mind. The freckled boy stared at the beam as if it were a grave marker. Jonathan waited. He would not drag them. He would not shout. Freedom that depends on volume is brittle. Liberty rooted in conscience endures. Choose, he said. The tall one stepped first. He rapped the first joint with his knuckles. Solid. He rapped the second. Old. He barely touched the third, careful not to leave a mark. Time-sick. The lie landed dull. Jonathan said nothing. He beckoned the bright-booted youth. The boy traced the edges, trying to act indifferent, but his finger paused on a fresh plane as smooth as confession. He flinched and named the wrong piece. A hiss went through the crowd, more sorrow than rage. Last, the freckled boy. He pressed his ear to the wood. He let the cold speak. He closed his eyes and breathed, as he had learned to do when aiming. Then he laid his palm on the failed joint and whispered, "This one was cut last." Night. The words shook. They held. He did not look up. It will not bear a man. No one moved. Not the council. Not the sergeant. Not even the British far away, frozen in their little theatre. The ring of colonists stood within hearing of something larger than crime. They heard a choice unfold. A small rebellion, not against authority, but against the rot that authority sometimes hides. Jonathan's gaze rested on the boy until the boy raised his head. "Truth is the first discipline," the old man said. "Not powder, not drill, truth." He let the word travel. It found the far tent where a widow folded a threadbare quilt. It found the cookfire where broth had been stretched with snow. It found the child who had learned to carry water without spilling a tear. We will not become the thing we resist. The tall one looked ready to spit. Pride seldom kneels to reason. The bright-booted youth lifted his chin as if a rope pulled it. But the freckled boy sagged, then straightened with a hurt. That looked like courage being born. "We did it," he said hoarsely, speaking before fear could reclaim him. We thought he'd leave." He glanced at Jonathan's arm, at the sling. Shame reddened his face. "I didn't want to. I followed." He turned to the ring. "I followed because I feared losing the laughter." The field did not jeer. The field understood the price of mockery sold cheap. The sergeant stepped forward and took the musket from the boy's hands, not as punishment, but as weight removed. The council conferred in a tight knot, low voices like bees. On the ridge, one officer snapped his glass shut, annoyed that the spectacle refused to devour itself on command. Jonathan lifted his hand again. "Punishment will come from those with the right to give it," he said, nodding slightly toward the council. "But there is something older than penalty." He let the crowd lean toward him. "Repair!" He pointed to the ruined joint. You three will rebuild the tower with the yaw. Carpenter, you mocked by your deceit. You will climb it first when it stands, and you will take the worst hours of watch until snow leaves these fields. No roar, no drum, only breath, only the hard relief of a verdict that preserved the camp's soul without spilling its blood. The tall one bristled, but the bright-booted youth looked at his hands as if seeing tools where he once saw toys. The freckled boy nodded, a single bare movement that carried the shape of repentance. Across the crowd, eyes shone with a fragile heat. Poor farmers understood repair. Mothers understood vigil. Elders understood penance that did not destroy a man. Dignity found room to breathe. Jonathan's shoulder throbbed. His ribs burned. He kept his spine straight. Demonstration concluded, he said quietly. Return to drill. But no one moved yet. They lingered as people do when they witness a small transformation and fear it might vanish if they blink. Then a rider crested the far path, coat rimed with frost, horse flecked with foam. Not the messenger from yesterday, a different courier. He waved a strip of cloth blackened by smoke. When he reached the ring, his voice tore the air. A loyalist raid. A farm burned near the river. A widow missing. Tracks toward the British pickets. The ridge stirred like a nest of knives. The council stiffened. The sergeant took a step that was almost a charge. The crowd inhaled as one, grief turning instantly to iron. Jonathan's eyes found the three boys. They were already looking back at him, faces pale, pride cracked open, something new struggling to stand where swagger had lived. The field waited for orders. The old man drew a breath that scraped like flint, the weight of sacrifice settling on his injured frame. And as the wind shifted and brought the smell of char, he lifted his hand once more, this time not for a lesson, but for a march that would pull the camp into a colder, truer test. They gathered in a hard half-circle, frost smoking from breath, and sleeves, muskets quiet against ribs. Officers of the camp stood at the rim, faces carved from sleepless stone. Beyond the trees, English glasses flashed like cold eyes, waiting for a stumble to turn into collapse. Jonathan Hale stepped forward, sling tight against his side, and set a small bundle on a powder crate. No flourish, only facts. He unwrapped the cloth, pine splinters, a bent nail with fresh shine, a wedge shaved at the wrong angle, a strip of leather glued with resin grains, the color of winter honey. He spoke plainly, each word placed as if laying planks for a bridge over disgrace. Tool marks first. He lifted a beam scrap scarred by a thin blade. A joiner's chisel leaves a flat tongue when it bites. Storm rot leaves chew and fuzz. He held the scrap so the soldiers could feel the clean plane with their thumbs. Men who had hewn fence posts nodded without meaning to. This is not weather. This is will. He pointed at the bent nail. Hammered out, then forced back. Fresh bruise on the metal. See the crescent? The scarred sergeant leaned close, grunted once. The quartermaster, ink still wet on his fingers, squinted and swallowed. Truth bothered him. It asked him to remember who he served. Contradictory hours, Jonathan continued, turning to the council's ledger a clerk had brought, reluctant but obedient. Lamp rations checked. Last oil issued to 3 privates at the second bell after midnight. He tapped the names with a knuckle that did not shake. They claimed sleep at that hour. The clerk says otherwise. The camp shifted. No thunder. Only the dry crackle of falsehood losing its shape. He set the strip of leather in the bright light. Resin from fresh pine caught here. It's the color of new sap, not ambered by time. You find the same grit in the seam of a boot when the foot rests against a shaved joint. He turned, and the bright-booted youth froze. Jonathan did not sneer. He simply showed the heel to the ring, specks like stars against black Polish. A frame whispers to the man who hurts it. It leaves a little of itself behind. He crouched, breath tight with pain, and sketched the grove with a coal stub on a torn sack. Footpaths, 3 sets. One long striding, cutting corners. One shuffling, turning often. One hesitant. Stops here, here, and here. He tapped the pauses. A conscience stops a heel where fear will not. The freckled boy's eyes flooded and did not spill. He held himself upright because dignity still had claims on him. Jonathan drew their attention to the tower's fake fatigue. Wedges reset away from grain. A carpenter would never. He listens to wood the way a mother listens to a child learning letters. These cuts want to look old. They only look guilty. He let the sentence rest. He let men who had been called crude by merchants and nobles feel for once like judges in their own country. He did not howl. He did not hound. He allowed the camp to decide how to hear what it already knew. Women stepped closer, bowls forgotten in hands. An elder pressed a rosary of carved seeds into her palm, lips tight, not with piety but with resolve. Children went still in that animal way that means something is being weighed which will touch their sleep. The tall boy tried swagger and found no ground to stand on. His voice cracked. He tried again. It was a jest gone wrong. The word jest dropped like lead. No one picked it up. The bright-booted youth stared at the leather strip as if it were a verdict, written with his name. The freckled boy breathed once and said nothing. His silence was the only honorable thing he owned. Jonathan's tone did not rise. "We fight men who buy obedience and sell shame. We will not do their labor for them." He lifted the ledger. "Freedom begins where excuses end." He closed it and returned it to the clerk with a nod that said, "Duty belongs to the humble as much as to the titled." Then he faced the officers. "Discipline is not a spectacle, sirs. It is a covenant. If we break our own frame, we do the redcoats' work and hand them our dead on clean paper." The council looked from fragments to faces. The decision was no longer difficult. Stripes of punishment would be inked later, but the larger sentence, repair, watch, penance, had already been passed by the ring itself. Something invisible shifted in the cold, an early thaw beneath the ice of humiliation. Not forgiveness, not yet, but an oath remade in the open. He turned to the men with muskets. "Attend the yo!" Last proof. He lifted the chisel a carpenter had brought at his request, its edge honed honest. He set it against the practice frame and drew a true channel along the grain, clean, whisper smooth. Then he set the saboteur's wedge beside it, ragged, cross-grained. Time teaches one line, treachery cuts another. He guided a dozen hands to feel both. Calluses learned what eyes might miss. The lesson seeded itself like winter wheat under snow, waiting for a sun it had not yet seen. Across the ridge, a British officer yawned and passed his glass to a younger man with a ring soft as cream. They were amused that beggars lectured beggars. They were wrong about the kind of wealth-changing hands here. Dignity is coin no empire mints, and today it moved in silence from one battered soul to another. Jonathan wrapped the proofs, slow and careful, as if binding a wound. He straightened, pain flaring where bone met will. He let it pass through him. "We do not throw boys to the wolves," he said, not looking at the suspects, looking instead at the crowd. "We turn them into sentries who do not sleep." The scarred sergeant nodded once, a hard benediction. A tremor of hoofbeats approached from the river path, thin at first, then swelling. The messenger cut the frost with his cry, ash on his cloak, smoke in his hair. The smell of a field turned to cinders. Names broke from his mouth like boards snapping. A homestead sacked, a widow taken, loyalist filth riding under a borrowed king's promise. The ridge shifted, amused no longer. Steel glinted. The day tightened. Jonathan did not flinch. He looked at the three boys as if handing them back their lives. "Retrieve your tools," he said quietly. "You will rebuild what you broke after you march." He turned to the line. Every voice, every stomach, every scar, suddenly one body. "We move light. We move now." The camp inhaled. not with bravado, but with that stern breath men take when they decide to bleed for something larger than breath. The old man adjusted his sling, set his jaw against the fire in his ribs, and stepped off, the ring parting to make a road that would carry them from exposure to rescue, from shame to service, and toward an encounter waiting in the black timber where the hidden truth of his own past would meet the nation's first hard choice. Cold sunlight cut the field into hard shapes. The ring closed again, tighter, meaner. News of the raid hung over them like smoke, but before the march the council called judgment. Order first, then steel. The three boys stood in front of the powder crate where Jonathan had set his proofs. They looked smaller by daylight, swagger drained, faces raw, boots dull with frost. The officers formed a line behind the council, grim as headstones. Poor farmers and widows pressed close, cheeks wind-burned, eyes tired of seeing dignity traded for vanity. On the ridge, British glasses glittered, patient as vultures. The tall boy spoke first. He tried certainty. It came. Out thin. We checked that tower last week. It was failing already. His gaze skittered. The storm? There was no storm, a quartermaster said, voice flat, ledger in hand, ink like judgment. The boy blinked. He doubled down. I meant frost. Frost splits pine. The cuts run cross-grain, the scarred sergeant answered. Frost doesn't choose angles. The bright-booted youth leaped into the gap. Words tumbled. We were patrolling. We saw someone near the grove. Might have been loyalists. Could have been them. He faltered. They loosened it. We chased. We lost them. He nodded too fast, as if begging his own lie to grow legs. Which hour? The councilman asked. Before midnight. Your oil was drawn at the second bell after midnight, the clerk said, not angry, only exact. You signed. The boy opened his mouth, closed it. He stared at his heel. Resin still clung to the seam like pollen. He scraped at it with a nail that shook. The freckled youth tried silence and found it heavy. Panic broke him open. We didn't mean death, he blurted. Only a scare, only enough to send him home. He swallowed. He fell. He could have died. I know. His chest heaved. I tried to stop them. I swear I did. He looked at Jonathan's sling. His voice thinned to a thread. I failed. A murmur rolled the circle. Not glee, weariness. This was the price of contempt when it blossoms into action. A mother touched the scar at her wrist, left by a British officer who called her property, and smiled. An elder gripped a cane carved from a fence post, taken by taxis, and returned as firewood. The camp understood disgrace. It knew where it leads. Jonathan did not move. He kept his eyes on the council, not the boys. He had offered repair. He had spoken for conversion, not ruin. But he would not shield treachery from consequence. Liberty requires spine as much as mercy. The tall boy felt the ground sliding. He lunged for another story. He told us to inspect the beams, he said, suddenly thrusting a finger toward Jonathan. He sent us. We only... The sergeant's gaze cut him down. You never logged an inspection. The bright-booted youth snapped. Why trust a stranger? No rank, no papers. He could be a spy. Look at his arm. Look at the way he talks. Like a British officer sometimes. It was a dangerous throw. It landed at the council's feet with a hiss. Jonathan's face did not change. He lifted his good hand and said only, I have fought under both flags. One fed me orders and called it honor. The other starves me and asks for courage. I remain where conscience allows me to breathe. It was not defense. It was a revelation left on the table like bread. The councilman in the middle, hair iron grey, eyes smoked by grief, cleared his throat. We have heard enough. He looked to the ring, then to the ridge, then back to the boys. Sabotage of a post in wartime, betrayal of a compatriot, conspiracy to cause injury. You sought to strike dignity in the dark. You... Nearly broke an old man who stood a wall where your pride would not. He let the air hold the words. Guilty. The verdict moved through the crowd like a cold wind. The tall boy clenched his jaw till muscle jumped. The bright-booted youth went pale. The freckled boy squeezed his eyes shut, as if delaying the blow would lessen it. Then came the sentence. No drum roll, no speech. "You are stripped of instruction," the councilman said. "Your sashes are removed. Your names struck from the roster. You will not carry this camp's colors. You will depart by sundown. The gate will not open for you again." Expulsion. That word is a blade that cuts deeper than stripes. It takes away the one place where shame could be remade into service. The ring did not cheer. The ring did not taunt. It left them the one gift humiliation seldom grants. A quiet exit with a full weight of what they had done. Jonathan's mouth pressed thin. His eyes dipped for a heartbeat, then leveled. He spoke once to the council. "Let them walk with provisions, a loaf and a blanket. No man should freeze for a lesson, not when our enemies warm their hands at stolen hearths." The council nodded. Justice without cruelty, the only kind that makes a nation worth defending. The sergeant stepped forward. He removed the boy's sashes with care, not glee. Cloth whispered across coats. The tall one tried to hold the end, as if it were a rope that could drag him back toward belonging. It slid free. The bright-booted youth's lips trembled. The freckled boy whispered, "I am sorry," and the words fell at Jonathan's boots like coins no one would spend. A cart waited by the gate. A single plank seat. No escort, no song. The boys climbed on, each movement more awkward than battle. The camp watched in silence. The British on the ridge watched with delight. They loved seeing rebels fracture. Wealthy men love cracked wood. It burns faster. The cart rolled. Snow squealed under wheels. A child raised a hand and then lowered it, unsure if pity was allowed. The freckled boy glanced back once. He didn't look at the council. He looked at the tower's broken bones. He looked at Jonathan's sling. Shame firmed into something that might one day be courage, but the gate swallowed him before it could stand. The council turned to tasks. A raid to answer, a widow to find, a river path to read like scripture. Orders snapped, flint checked, rations split thinner. The crowd dissolved into lines and chores, that steady rebellion of ordinary hands refusing to surrender. Dignity kept moving. That is how independence starts. Slow steps, no trumpet, the sound of breath and resolve. Jonathan remained by the powder crate after the field emptied, as if listening to the ground. Pain gnawed his ribs. The sling cut his shoulder. He sensed a presence before he heard it. The scarred sergeant. "You would have kept them," the sergeant said, not accusing, only taking measure. "I would have rebuilt them," Jonathan answered. The council preserved the camp. He accepted the split. Duty over desire. He had made harder decisions in other winters. Under another banner, he had obeyed men who smiled through ruin. He would not repeat that obedience now. From the ridge, a British horn sounded, lazy and confident. Officers turned their horses and drifted behind the trees, content to let hunger do their killing. Jonathan looked toward the path to the river. Ash floated there, a faint ghost against the sky. He gathered the bundle of proofs and tucked it away. He lifted his hand to the sergeant. "Form the column. Light packs. Quiet march." The sergeant nodded and moved with that mechanical grace soldiers earn through grief. Men fell in. Women pressed scarves into calloused palms. An elder traced a cross in the air, not sanctifying war, blessing endurance. Children ran alongside, until the sergeant snapped a look that sent them back to the fires. Jonathan took the front, breath shallow, gaze fixed on timber gone black in the knee. Distance. Behind him, boots started the beat that drives history when kings won't listen. The gate opened for the living. It closed for the expelled. Snow took prints and made them equal. The journey bent toward the river bend, where lies wear uniforms and truth gets priced like wheat. And somewhere ahead, past the smoke and the reeds, waited a face from Jonathan's buried years, a hidden truth with an English sword at its hip, and a choice that would demand more than pain from the old patriots. Battered frame. Night settled over the camp like a wounded prayer, soft but trembling. The fires burned low, casting long shadows over the ragged tents and silent rifles. After the march, after the rescue, after the smoke cleared from the river's edge, the patriots returned, carrying the weight of what they had seen and what they had saved. A widow found alive, loyalists driven back into the dark, and Jonathan Hale, battered but unbroken, walking at the front as if pain were merely another duty to shoulder. He should have been resting. Instead he stood near the old flagpole, the wind stirring the frayed banner above him. His sling hung loose, his ribs throbbed, but his spine remained straight, as if the entire cause leaned gently against him, and he refused to let it fall. In the faint glow, he looked like a relic carved from endurance itself. Recruits crossed the yard in slow lines, heading to their posts, their blankets, their meager soup. One by one, they paused. Not long. Enough to draw attention, just enough to bow their heads. A quiet salute, a murmured "Sir," a hand pressed to the heart before stepping into darkness. Men who had mocked him now walked with reverence. Boys who once smirked now avoided his gaze out of respect, not fear. Dignity has a sound. It is soft, nearly invisible, but tonight it echoed like a hymn. Jonathan answered each nod with a calm that did not waver. No triumph, no pride, only that solemn grace carried by those who have lost too much to enjoy victory loudly. He had endured disgrace, betrayal, near death, and the cold judgment of a world that worships youth and forgets the price of wisdom. Yet here he stood, proving that strength is not measured in muscle or speed, but in the fierce loyalty one bears to country and conscience. The camp breathed differently now, as if a veil had lifted. The British on the ridge could mock the ragged coats and patched boots, but they could not touch what had awakened in these men, the more. Slow, rising certainty that independence is born from souls like this old volunteer, souls that refuse to kneel, souls that stand even when age or injury says they should fall. Above him, the torn banner snapped once, catching a brief flame glow. It reminded the soldiers of the fire they carried inside, not of anger, but of purpose, the kind of fire no empire can extinguish. Jonathan lifted his chin, watching the stars through the smoke. Those cold lights had witnessed centuries of conquest, tyranny, and broken promises. Tonight, for the first time, they watched a camp of farmers, widows, boys, and elders take one small step closer to becoming a nation. A land where dignity would no longer be a luxury, where liberty would not be begged for, but lived, where ordinary hands, scarred, trembling, frostbitten, would shape a destiny that kings could never imagine. He exhaled, slow and steady, as the final recruits passed him with quiet reverence, and in that breath lived the whole truth of the journey. A man may age, but courage does not. A body may weaken, but the flame of independence spreads from one heart to another until it becomes unstoppable. This was his offering, his sacrifice, his legacy, and tomorrow, when the drums called again, he would answer, because freedom demands no less. Tell me, Patriot, did you feel this story? If it moved you, leave your like and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you wish to walk beside us in more tales of struggle and valor, your subscription helps this humble camp grow and keep the flame of liberty alive.